You know, when you have more and more young Muslims that grow up in affluent surroundings, that see themselves as sort of good soldiers for whatever is fashionable, right? You know, and they're sort of spending a lot of their time on college campuses, or they're young professionals. They are immersed and entrenched in an environment that is constantly confirming and reaffirming a particular view of the world. And for a person to be sort of isolated outside of that, you know, intellectually, right, takes a lot of conviction, to be the lone person, the lone man out, if you will, when everyone around you does that. And at some point, what happens is people have to reconcile themselves to that. And so the first stage of that reconciliation, and you know, just the status anxiety problem, is to actually come to a point where you say, okay, well, you know, I'll personalize this issue as something wrong for me, but not wrong for anyone else.
Right.
And once you've personalized the issue in that way, you've enervated your own commitments of any force. There's no muscle behind it, right? It's plastic now, because if something represents a moral right or a moral wrong, it has to mean something beyond me.
Is right.
It has to carry a meaning that exists in the real world. And applies to at least more than me as an individual and how I think about things, right? You know, when we personalize things, I might say, hey, well, you know, I like this type of food, for instance. I like pizza. I don't know about everyone else, right? That's something that carries very little stakes, right? And so if I like pizza, for instance, I can recognize that, you know, other people don't like pizza, whatever, but I wouldn't say, for instance, on something that I think is very morally significant, that, well, you know, I'm against killing, you know, unarmed civilians, for instance, right, or innocent civilians, if you're talking about war, or I'm against racism, or I'm against this, or I'm against that. You'd say, I mean, of course you'd. Any decent human being would be, right? You most often people would say, I believe that this is right and wrong, and I believe it's right and wrong, not for me subjectively and relativistically. It's not just my perspective. I believe that this is wrong for society and humanity and everything else, right? And that we need reforms that can address these problems. And this issue is one that quickly lends itself to a personalizing, and then the personalizing leads itself to theological reform.
Right.
Once you personalize it, you don't really feel that it has great moral force at that point, anyways.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. Now, okay, so I want you to talk just a little bit about your recent piece, which is was posted on the Muslim Matters, and the male is not like the female, Sunni Islam and gender nonconformity. You know, could you sort of summarize that for the audience?
Yeah, so I'll try to summarize it quickly. So there's two pieces. The first one was focused exclusively on classical fiqh discourse tied to the subject of the muhannath, the mutarajjil, and the khuntha mushkil. So we're talking about intersex persons, so hermaphrodites. We're talking about the muhannath, he's an effeminate male, that is a biological male, and then a mannish female, biological female who has mannish behaviors. And that, if people want to read that, there's a lot of drawing on fiqh and classical fiqh tradition in that particular piece. The second piece that was published at the end of last year, so only a couple of weeks ago, was bringing all of that to bear and trying to bring it into conversation with contemporary transgenderism. And it did so on two grounds. First, it tried to address the various discourses that are important to recognize when you talk about transgenderism. So gender constructionism. So is gender just something that is socially constructed? The trans brain argument. So to what degree is transgenderism a reflection of someone's brain phenotype? And do brain morphological patterns give us any indication of a person's gender nonconformity? Psychologically, where are the debates within the field of psychology? What is the history of the activist movement of transgenderism, and how has it emerged? And what are the major points of discussion that remain with us? And then finally, theologically, right? How do we look at all of that and conceive of that as Muslims? So those are the various issues, and there were medical things also. You know, the medicalization of individuals, what are the various forms of medicalization, and then side effects, consequences, complications, all of that. So there's a lot of detail in that paper for people who are interested in the subject.
Right. So, I mean, as you know, of course, being one who's able to delve into the Islamic sources and the authoritative sources of Islam, that our tradition is pretty, dynamic, and is very rich when it comes to dealing with new issues. And the question of, the individual of obscure gender, sort of make it a broad category, is not something new to Islamic jurisprudence. And as you pointed out, of course, the examples of the asexual person, the person who lacks passion, or the individual, the hermaphrodite, even what is called mukhannath, which is one of the categories of people which were dealt with in your writing, and the mukhannath being of two types, right? And I think this is an important point to highlight for the audience, is that the classical scholars actually made a distinction between the individual who has female mannerisms, the gait, the sort of intonation of her voice, et cetera, if these are suspected or believed to be, they can be sort of natural sort of things which result from the way that person's physical being or a person's anatomy has been constructed. And the ulama generally, they did not object to those type of people. But then on the other hand, there were those who actually took on feminine characteristics. And the Prophet ﷺ, he cursed both women who imitated men and men who imitated women. And that in itself, this last point about the curse, I think is an extremely important point to reflect upon, because of the arguments and the debates right now today about whether or not gender is that much different from sex, or if gender itself has no connection to biological sex, right? Yeah. And so fundamentally, it seems that the Prophet ﷺ, he believed that they did have a connection. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any reason for him to actually curse a woman who acts like a man, or a man who acts like a woman, or a man who dresses like a man, or and vice versa. Right? So, sure. You have anything else to add to that particular point?
No, I think that's a very, very good way of putting it. I think people have to recognize that, for people who are congenitally, meaning biologically predisposed to certain behaviors, meaning their voice is, let's say, higher than normal, for instance, such that it's a feminine voice, and something that might, if someone's just talking on the phone, you can get mistaken easily for a woman, or, if a man walks with a particular sway that you look at and say, well, that's a bit flamboyant, or it's more feminine in gait or walk, then, those are things that, to your point, the vast majority of the fuqaha did not blame a person for the emergence and the manifestation of that, because it wasn't regarded as something that they had their own volitional choice, right? It wasn't something that they were doing deliberately. Now, even then, your point, they're simply having that as a part of a person's sort of internal constitution does not give a sort of open license to act and behave in ways that go and extend beyond that, right? So even if a man, for instance, speaks and walks like a woman, it doesn't mean he can dress like one. And that's why, to your point, the hadith of La'an, where you have the hadith of Prophet ﷺ, La'an al-Nabi ﷺ, al-mukhanathin min al-rijal wal-mutarajjalat min al-nisa, right? That the Prophet ﷺ cursed the effeminate woman and the mannish, the effeminate male and the mannish female. That hadith in Sahih Bukhari actually falls under Kitab al-Libas, right? The chapter on dress. The chapter on dress is where we actually see that. And this is something that a lot of the scholars commented on in general. And so to your point, I think in some ways that can be very eye-opening for Muslims who are unfamiliar with classical fiqh. They're unfamiliar with just how much, it's really remarkable when you read about the khuntha, the mushkil in general, because it is such an obscure case. It's such an obscure, you're talking about something that is, rarefied, right, amongst humanity. It isn't something that is the norm by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
And certainly, even people who are born physiologically ambiguous hermaphrodite, by the time they reach adolescence and puberty, they tend to regularize, right? And you tend to get gender expressed in a way that's far more unambiguous, right? So the masculinity appears post adolescence, right? Because with pubertal development, you have things that generally make it clear what they are, even if you have some ambiguous genitalia issues and things like that. So you don't have a ton of situations where this is occurring, right? Statistically, even in the West, this is a very, very extremely rare condition, and yet you have so much fiqh discussion on that particular scenario. And ikhtilaf and scholars elaborating what to do with this and what to do with that, and it really is a remarkable point to focus, simply to say that that there was a sense that fiqh had to be in conversation with the possibilities of humanity, right? And I think it's important for us to recognize that what we're dealing with today is certainly a new social phenomenon. But we don't have a new category of humanity. Like we didn't bring a new human being into existence.
Right.
A lot of people say, "Oh, this is unprecedented." And we'll say, "Well, what's unprecedented? Like we didn't just create a new type of human being,
right?
But you have people who are living in different ways." But in terms of phenomenologically, right? This isn't like the invention of the internet or something. It's like no one could have invented. But this is or some like major technological development. This is just human beings acting differently, behaving. And I'm not saying that to trivialize it. I'm simply saying it to suggest that people who say, okay, have we ever had situations where men felt predisposed to behave like women and vice versa? Certainly we have. Certainly we have. And that particular subject has been written and spoken about. And you can look to that for inspiration to try to understand how as Muslims we can understand what's going on today.
Yeah, I like to take a step back a little bit and talk about the issue of homosexuality overall, right? And the reason I want to do that is because, believe it or not, there are a lot of people, many of the people, even Muslims, who still don't really understand some of these subtle differences between the different members of the particular alphabet that we constantly talk about when we say LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. And so some people, there are some Muslims, I'm not talking about a large number of Muslims, but it seems like there's still at least people in my life, who, if they see a man dressed as a woman, they just say homosexuality. It says he's homosexual, right? Right? That's what, so they don't make a distinction between transvestite, transgender, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, person is gay, right? And which I think is important for us to talk about exactly what is a transgender, but also to talk about the question of whether or not identifying oneself on the basis of your sexual appetite is a valid way to identify yourself from a basic Islamic standpoint.
Yeah, well, the alphabet's quite long now, so even I get confused when people spell it out. I'm like, I don't know what's going on anymore. It's too many letters, and there are too many obscure groups these days. I think obviously there's a great conflation that's taking place when you have an initialism like that. You have a conflation between sexual attraction and who people feel sexually attracted to, and even that conflates a lot. Because it conflates, okay, well, I'm sexually attracted to somebody versus what my identity is, versus how I think about things culturally and politically, versus how I conceive of moral rights and wrongs. I mean, all of these things are conglomerated in a way which makes them totally undifferentiated. The fact that they're undifferentiated presents major theological problems, because what you have is people who internalize an identity that prefabricates for them answers to all of those questions. Prefabricates for them answers to what is morally right or wrong. It answers for them who their identity is. It tells them how they should think about various causes and how they should think about their politics and how they should think about what's taking place culturally in various spaces. It tells them how they should dress, how they should live, where they should hang out, who they should make friends with. The fact that it encompasses so much makes it such a severe problem, because when a person, when a person takes on that type of identity and lives according to the lifestyle that's associated with it, the idea that we can walk up to such a person and try to convince them that there's something morally wrong with the sexual acts that are derivative of those desires is very far-fetched, and usually something that people have by that point come to reflexively reject as bigoted and hateful and malicious and everything in between. And so that becomes a very, very complicated issue. Right. Beyond that, I'll say even just on when we talk about homosexuality, there's a lot that's conglomerated in the differences between, there are significant differences between lesbianism and male homosexuality. Talk about penis. They're not the same phenomenon sociologically or in sort of a lived capacity. They're very, very different. Mm-hmm. And you'll see actually a number of lesbian writers who write about that. Not just that, lesbianism seems to be a little more volatile in terms of the transitioning between lesbians and eventually transitioning over to becoming bi. That happens less frequently with people who are gay, right? And so again, there are a lot of differences here that are extremely significant, that are worth teasing out, but that would take a long time. Transgenderism itself, in some ways, is at least conceptually contradictory to homosexuality, because homosexuality it's homosexuality. It's I am attracted to someone of the same sex. Transgenderism treats sex as something that is subordinate, and what